All right. Okay. That's what our workshop will be about. Let's try to make it interactive, because if we don't ask questions or if you don't reflect on what I'm saying, maybe this, it's not going to be as effective as I want it to be. Well, guys, as I told you before, you are expert teaching, but most of our teachers base the teaching performance on the textbook and not on the competences the learners have to achieve at the end of the course. That is why at the end of the program, we have a lot of basic learners, a lot of basic students. And maybe you'll ask yourself, but I'm doing, my best to teach, but I don't understand why these people do not grasp all the information. And we start to justify, and just say, well, my students are not doing their job. That's what many teachers say about that. But I know that you are hard workers. Anyway, I would like, to review all about planning and objectives. Let's get in started. Well, I hope you can see this. Let me see if I can. Okay. Look, here we have, that when you start teaching, you have this. Instead of T, you got an S. Students will be able to, at the end of the class, the students will be able to, and you start, sharing the objectives. But in this workshop, what I have is teachers will be able to identify the characteristic of well-written lesson objectives using the SMART criteria. Familiarize ourselves with Bloom's taxonomy and how to use it to create objectives that reflect different levels of thinking and learning. And the last but not least, discuss best practices for aligning lesson objectives with assessment and instructional methods. Maybe you ask yourself, wow, that's too much for one section workshop, but I promise I'm going to make it practical. The first 20 minutes, we're going to socialize some theory. Then we are going to cover some practical exercises. The first one, identify the characteristic of well-written lesson objectives and using the SMART criteria. I know that all of you know the meaning of SMART. I also know that you are familiarized with Bloom's when you are creating lesson plan. But anyway, we'll try to go over the presentation, and maybe we are going to learn something new today. Don't worry about taking notes, because as soon as we finish or complete the workshop, I will share the presentation with you all so that you can go over it whenever you want. Well, we have over here the importance of lesson planning. I'm not going to open the section of questions now because I want to advance. Number one, clarify the goals and objectives for the lesson. So that is the number one. Organize and structure the content and activities of the lesson. Consider the different needs and abilities of the students. Anticipate and overcome potential challenges and difficulties. Assess and evaluate student learning. With this slide, I can tell you that most of our teachers in the program focus on the content that is printed out in the textbook. They forget about the competences that the students have to achieve based on the common European framework of references that we utilize to create the SLOs that students have to achieve at the end of each level. When we talk about organization, organize and structure the content and activities of the lesson, most of our teachers follow the lessons, the content in the book, in the textbook, and they follow the activities that are there, and that's it, instead of following the learning objective. So if as a teacher, you don't have a clear objective for the lesson, what you are teaching content, but you don't have a goal. Okay, as I said, I'll try to advance because we are summarizing things that you know. What are the main elements of lesson planning? Well, number one, we have the learning objectives, as I said before, the specific knowledge, skill, or attitudes that students should be able to demonstrate after the lesson. So that is what you have to have clear in your mind, that at the end of each lesson you teach, your student must be able to perform a task, something that is connected to real life. Then we have the content. The content is the information, concepts, or skills that will be covered during the lesson. Then, as I said before, most teachers only follow the books, Unit 1, page 2, page 3, until the end. That is not as it works. I will show you how. After that, we have the activities, the tasks or exercises that students will engage in to learn and practice the content. Material and resources. I understand that most of you don't have money to buy or create materials and resources every day, but you have your cell phone. Then with your cell phone, you can just, copy some or download some images in WhatsApp and send it to WhatsApp, and the students can use it using their phone in class. But when we talk about materials and resources, it's not only the book or the board, it's more than that. The tools and resources that will be used during the lesson, text, videos, handouts, this is very important, and etc., because, that is an endless amount of materials that a creative teacher prepares. Finally, the assessment and evaluation, the methods and criteria used to measure student learning and progress. I was very concerned last year when I noticed that some of you and other teachers assign 100% of the score for oral presentation, participation and homework. That is not possible. If you assess your student well, it is not possible that 30 students have 100% of the task completed. Well, that is the ideal, that's what we want, what we expect, our expectations. But we are human beings, we are not robots. Then we need to follow the correct procedures in order to assess our student and assign scores that are aligned with the level of English they are receiving or they have. Then when we are planning, we need to plan with the end in mind. Then the section of questions coming now. Are you following me?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes.
let's continue. As I said, don't worry, I will send the presentation. Then you can go over it at home. Then when we plan, we need to plan with the end in mind. We need to ask a lot of questions. As teachers, we need to know where you, as a teacher, you are taking your students. Number two, you need to keep students on track to reach their goals. Once you wrote the objective on the board, you need to plan activities that match the objectives. If you want them to be able to apply the information at the end of the class. You need to set a clear purpose for each lesson. You need to work backwards when planning. When we work backwards, we are planning with the end in mind. You anticipate possible predicaments and you find ways to solve that. Maybe you have weak students, you have students who cannot understand, who have difficulties, and then you create remedial activities for that specific students, and you personalize teaching and learning. You think about what students should be able to do at the end of the lesson. But you also consider the skills and content that students should be able to demonstrate during and at the end of the lesson. Ensure that students retain important information. You see that sometimes you start a lesson, students have to go home. Then when they are coming back, you ask them, they don't remember. It's difficult for them to retain important information. They easily forget. Maybe lack of practice and exposure to the language. Let's move on. Let's watch this video. Very short video, right?
Hello and welcome to Teachings in Education, Writing Lesson Objectives. Written objectives should be characterized as SMART. S stands for specific, M stands for measurable, A stands for achievable, R relevant, and T time bound. Up first, specific. It's important to narrow in on what it is exactly you want your students to do. Objectives should be well defined to students, observable to teachers, and describe the who, what, when, where, and why of the lesson.
You see, observable to teachers, well-defined to students, and the objective should describe the who, what, when, where, and why. I'm sorry.
Hello and welcome. RIT, M stands for T time bound. Up first, specific. It's important to narrow in on what it is exactly you want your students to do. Objectives should be well defined to students, observable to teachers, and describe the who, what, when, where, and why of the lesson. On to measurable. Objectives must be measurable so that teachers know if students are actually learning the objectives. So make sure your objectives can be evaluated. Third, achievable. What you don't want to do is set your students up for failure. Be sure that your students are academically ready to complete the objective. Remember, you want to set your students up for success. Next up, relevant. The lesson objective must be relevant to students' academic success and relevant to previous and future lessons. Objective must prepare students for standardized testing, relate to larger ideas, and build on prior knowledge. And lastly, you want your objectives to be time-bound. Set a time limit of 1 or 2 class periods. When setting time-bound objectives, be sure that there is enough time and you have an assigned date for completion. Right now, I'm going to outline a fully written objective for a typical lesson. 80% of students will be able to solve systems of equations using the elimination method by the end of the period and assessed using a 5-question multiple choice quiz.
All right. If you notice here, 80% of the students, it's a specific because you don't pretend that 100% of the students achieve the objectives. Then 80% of the students will be able to solve a system of equation. That is who the students, what they are going to be able to solve system of equations using the elimination method by the end of the period and assessed using a 5-question multiple choice quiz. That is how you project the lesson objective. But let's move on for you to have a clear idea of what I pretend you to understand, to notice, to identify, and then apply in your classroom. As they said, the objective has to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. When we say relevant here, it's that you need to connect the lesson with a real life situation to make it meaningful for the students. When they are performing practice, I'm sorry, I'm busy now, later, yes? Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. Somebody opened the door. Then that's what it's, relevant. And time bound, obviously, if you say at the end of the lesson, the students should be able to apply what you said they were going to do or apply it. If you check this slide here, when you're planning a lesson for your students, there are some questions you should ask yourself. Number one, what do I want my students to learn? Do I want my students to follow the textbook unit page by page? What specific content do I want my students to learn? How will I know that they have learned it? Then you can get the answers to these questions if the lesson objectives are well elaborated. If the objectives are specific, measurable, short-term, observable of students' behavior. And the lesson objectives are tools to ensure students reach the course goals. Okay. Then what is an effective lesson objective? What are the key elements of an effective objective? Number one, it states the context, the situation, the theme and topic of the lesson. You see, then you have to connect it with a hospital, with a real life situation as you see over here. Then what you are going to teach in the lesson should be connected to real life. Over here, the lesson objective identifies a communication task that learners will be able to do by the end of the lesson. Maybe a conversation or a role play. Focuses on one or two skill areas. Integrate listening, speaking, reading, and writing. But also, a lesson objective could involve grammar, vocabulary, or pronunciation. It all depends. So when you are teaching a lesson, you need to incorporate more than one skills to make it achievable, depending on your students' needs. Let's take a look now from theory to practice. Here, the effective objective. Look, this is the stand. By the end of the lesson, learners will be able to leave a simple workplace phone message. Then if you check here, number 3 is the speaking, the primary skill area. Then student will practice skill, the listening, the speaking, oral skill, oral production. But the assessment will be a role play, leaving a message. I'm going to assess my student through a role play. And the communication task will be to leave a message, a phone message. Finally, the context, the workplace, phone messages. So if you see over here in this objective, I have all these elements that you should take into account when you're planning your classes. Many teachers prefer to follow the books and the objectives that are written in the textbook. Then you don't have a clear objective. You're following the textbook, and that is mechanical instead of meaningful. By the end of the lesson, that is the time. At the end of the lesson, they are going to be able to leave a phone message. Who? The learners. The behavior to leave a simple workplace phone message, and the context at work. And then depending on the focus of the lesson, the objective can also give an indication of the grammar. For example, Learners will be able to take a phone message at work using indirect speech to report the message. Here's another objective. But depending on the focus of the grammar, it also will cover vocabulary. Learners will be able to leave a phone message stating reasons for not coming into work. Let's check this one. By the end of the lesson, learners will be able to write a 3-paragraph composition comparing weddings in 2 different cultures, if you see. You see? But use of Bloom taxonomy to create an objective. Example, at the end of the lesson, the students will be able to use the prepositions of place to indicate the location of the supermarket, the bank, the hospital, the movie theater, and the city hotel. You see, everything is connected to real life. The activities they will perform are connected to real life. And now we have the Bloom's taxonomy that not all of the teachers know or follow to prepare the lesson objectives. When you start introducing, people don't fall asleep, okay?
No, we are fine. We are fine.
Okay.
It's very interesting.
All right. When you are creating the lesson objective and you are introducing, for example, interchange unit A, interchange unit B, unit A, B, I'm sorry. Look, maybe we're going to complete the first 40 minutes, but remember, log in again to continue, okay?
Okay.
Uh-oh, what happened? Sorry.
Got it.
I'm sorry. Okay. Right. Are you here? Are you still here? All right. Then when you are introducing a topic for the first time, you need to follow the knowledge level of thinking. All the time when you are introducing a lesson, you need to start with a low level of thinking. Then you have to use this action to elaborate your lesson objectives. And I will demonstrate how later. Once you introduce it, you can go maybe the same day to the comprehension level. And then so on, based on the level of, obviously, if you have introduced it, then the student understand, then they can apply. But you cannot ask a person to apply an information that they don't understand. Then you need to show them how. And then you can advance and take your student to a different level of thinking. You can also use these questions to assess learning, to check for understanding. Instead of asking, do you understand? If you are teaching adjectives, you can ask the student, can you list 3 adjectives? The ones that you learned during the lesson? Can you recall the yesterday class or what I said? Can you select one of the adjectives to make a sentence? If your students are able to do that, to respond to the question, they understood. So you don't need to ask them, are you clear? Do you understand? So depending on the level of thinking, you have those critical thinking questions to check for students' understanding. Then little by little, you were just, at home, analyze this slide, but I will show you how to use it. Let me advance. Now, look at this. Besides the textbook, you have the competences that the Common European Framework of Reference offer for each level. Then these are the competences. That's what your basic learners must be able to apply at the end of the course. Look, then what you have to do is to relate this competences with the textbook and match it. When you are teaching, when you are using your textbook, you are going to follow the lesson, pages by pages, but you need to put some emphasis or stress and highlight the competences. So you have to continue teaching on every pages, yeah, obviously, but you need to focus on the competences. And I will show you how, no worries. Look, you see this? Your textbook, all the student's book and the teacher's guide has this, the plan of intro book. Then what we have to do is very simple. You use the slide I show you. I will send it to you as well. The basic one competences, and you match it with the textbook. For example, in the previous slide, the student have to say goodbye, hello and goodbye, use greetings. Then I'm going to emphasize that because it's one of the competences that the Common European Framework of Reference want my students to achieve. And then when I have this topic in the textbook, I need to create a lot of strategies to make it possible and achievable. But look, here we have giving opinions about jobs. Then when you have to teach that, you need to emphasize, you need to find strategies and make, do your best to transmit that information to your student and make it achievable as well. Look at this. Family, talk about family members. That is one of the competencies, but also describing weather and here seasons, talking about the weather and seasons and colors, another competences that is written over there. If you check over here, other competences is like students have to talk about likes and dislikes. That is one of the competences they have to achieve. And as you saw in this slide, I have to compare what the students are supposed to learn, to be able to learn, and what the test book offer. Remember that we have approximately 6 different textbooks. We have DoubleClick, we have Interchange, WordLink, and they do not follow the same structure. Then if we teach based on the textbook, our student will have different level of achievement. But if we teach based on competences, then we are going to prepare all the students with the same level. They will have the same performance. Let's take a look at this now. Just, where the section will end in 3 minutes, but we log in and we try to cover the whole workshop. And if you have questions, later, but now I need just, to have an idea of what I want you to do. All right, let's imagine that I'm going to start teaching a class. Then I start with a warm-up, I talk to my students, I introduce the warm-up. We are not going to speak about warm-up and icebreaker now, but anyway, I show the objectives. I share the objectives of the lesson with the student. By the end of the class, students will be able to, if I have many students, I ask one of my students to read the first objective. Identify and list words, phrases, and expressions to introduce themselves, say hello and goodbye. That's it. That is the way I have to present the objective to my students. If you check, identify is the first level of thinking, knowledge, and list is another level of thinking aligned with knowledge. This objective is just to introduce the topic. Now, this is how you need to have the objective in mind and written in the lesson plan. By the end of the class, the students will be able to identify and list words, phrases, and expressions to introduce themselves, say hello and goodbye, after reading a conversation in pairs, assessed with open-ended questions. So here everything is clear, everything is set. Students are, they are going to be grouped in pairs. They are going to read the conversations and then identify words and list words, phrases, and expressions to introduce themselves, say hello and goodbye. Well, perfect. But I'm going to assess them asking open-ended question. I'm almost ready. You see, let's check this one. Once I have introduced the knowledge objective, right? Let's go to the comprehension and application. My students are familiar with the vocabulary and phrases. Now they are ready to apply the information. By the end of the class, the students will be able to apply words, phrases, and expressions to introduce themselves, say hello and goodbye. Then I can't ask my students to do something that they don't understand. This is how you have to write it in the lesson plan. By the end of the class, the students will be able to apply words, phrases, and expressions to introduce themselves, say hello and goodbye after reading a conversation in pairs, assessed with a role play. If you see here, now my students are able to use the information and they can apply it using it. Here, after I have already presented the learning objective, I have the lesson. It's nice to meet you.